Welcome back to Valentra Tales, wishing you a truly good day, filled with calm moments and gentle things ahead. And now, let's step together into today's story.
Congratulations, failure. We're finished. He mocked me with his rich friends on my birthday and I slid my little gift across the table. Calmly, I said, explain to your sisters why tuition disappears, to your parents why their house and cars vanish in minutes, and to your partners why the company dies before dessert. I stood and the panic began. What kind of person serves divorce papers at his wife's birthday party? My mother had asked when I called her 2 weeks before, crying about the humiliation I knew was coming. But she was asking the wrong question. The right question was, what kind of person spends 6 months secretly preparing to destroy everything her husband values while pretending to be the devoted wife he expects? The answer was sitting at the far end of the table at Marcello's, watching Jake perform for his audience of sycophants, my hand resting on the envelope that would answer both questions in exactly the way he deserved. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand how I got to that moment, you need to understand the perfect illusion I'd been maintaining for years. That morning, 2 weeks after my mother's call, I woke at 5:30 a.m. just as I had every day for 8 years. Jake lay on his side of our California king bed, turned away from me even in sleep. The space between us might as well have been an ocean. I studied his back for a moment, remembering when he used to pull me close in those drowsy morning minutes before the day began. Now he hugged the edge of the mattress like he might catch something if he accidentally touched me. Our Westchester house was silent as I made my way to the kitchen. 5 bedrooms, 4 bathrooms, and a 3-car garage filled with the symbols of success Jake needed the world to see. The marble countertops were cold under my palms as I prepared his morning coffee with scientific precision. Ethiopian blend from that boutique roaster in Tribeca. 15 seconds in the grinder, not 14, not 16. Water heated to exactly 195 degrees. I'd learned the hard way that anything less than perfection would earn me that particular frown he'd perfected, the one that said I was disappointing him again. While the coffee brewed, I arranged his breakfast on the Wedgwood china his mother had given us for our 5th anniversary. Egg white omelette with organic spinach, no salt. 1 slice of whole grain toast with exactly 1 teaspoon of almond butter spread edge to edge. Fresh squeezed orange juice in the crystal tumbler that had to be positioned precisely 2 inches from the plate's edge. The kind of details that seemed loving unless you realized they were actually terms of an unspoken contract where my value was measured in successful performances. Jake appeared at 6:45, his internal clock as precise as everything else about his life. The charcoal Tom Ford suit hung perfectly on his frame, the Harvard Business School class ring catching the morning light. He sat at the kitchen island without acknowledging me, immediately absorbed in his phone. The investor meeting is at 10, he said without looking up. Make sure you're there by 9:45 to set up the conference room. Of course, I replied, maintaining the neutral tone I'd perfected. I've already prepared the presentation materials. What I didn't say was that I'd also spent 3 hours last night debugging the algorithm that made those impressive returns possible. The Pythia algorithm was my baby, born from my MIT doctorate in computational finance, nursed through countless sleepless nights of coding and testing. But in Jake's world, I was just the woman who arranged the papers and served the coffee while he explained my work to rooms full of men who pretended to understand it. 3 hours later, I stood in Meridian Capital's glass conference room arranging leather portfolios at each seat while Jake tested the presentation clicker. 20 investors would arrive soon, men with more money than imagination who relied on Jake to make them richer. They'd never know that the mathematical models he'd present, the revolutionary predictive analytics that consistently beat market expectations by 12%, had originated in my mind, not his. Remember, Jake said, adjusting his tie in the reflection of the window overlooking Manhattan, your administrative support if anyone asks. We don't want to confuse the narrative. The narrative. That was what our marriage had become. A carefully constructed story where Jake Harrison was the brilliant financial mind who'd built Meridian Capital from nothing, while I was the fortunate woman who'd married well. Never mind that I'd written every line of code that made our trading platform work. Never mind that I'd spent years developing algorithms that could predict market micromovements with uncanny accuracy. The investors filed in, shaking Jake's hand with the reverence reserved for someone who could multiply their wealth. I served coffee from the silver service, invisible as furniture while Jake launched into his presentation. He explained the Pythia algorithm's latest refinements with the confidence of someone who understood what he was saying, though I knew he'd memorized my explanations like lines in a play. The neural network processes approximately 12,000 data points per second, he said, clicking to a slide I'd designed at 2 a.m. Our proprietary machine learning model adapts in real time to market volatility. One investor, a sharp-eyed man named Morrison from a Connecticut hedge fund, raised his hand. How does the algorithm account for irregular trading patterns during after-hours sessions? Jake's smile never wavered, but I saw the micro-pause, the brief flicker of panic before he deflected. Excellent question. Let's table that for our technical deep dive next quarter. Now about those returns. I stood by the coffee service, my hands steady despite the urge to answer Morrison's question. The algorithm used a hybrid approach, combining pattern recognition with anomaly detection specifically calibrated for low-volume trading periods. I could have explained it in 30 seconds. Instead, I refilled water glasses and remained silent. That evening, we drove to Jake's parents' house in Greenwich for our weekly family dinner. The Harrison estate sprawled across 3 acres of manicured perfection, the kind of property that whispered old money even though Jake's father had earned his fortune in commercial real estate just 20 years ago. Margaret Harrison greeted us at the door, air-kissing Jake while barely acknowledging my existence. "Lexi dear," she said, the dear dropping like an ice cube into warm water. "You can put the wine in the kitchen." The dining room was set for 8. Jake's sisters, Emma and Sophia, were already there with their boyfriends, both law students who came from the right families. Conversation flowed around me rather than through me. Discussions of vacation properties and investment opportunities that assumed I had nothing to contribute. Emma's engagement party is next month, Margaret announced over the pot roast. The country club, of course. Senator Whitman's son deserves nothing less. "How wonderful," I said. "Can I help with?" Harrison Sr. laughed, cutting me off. "Lexi, sweetheart, you just focus on keeping my son happy. Let the women who understand these things handle the party planning." The women who understand these things. As if I hadn't been secretly managing their investment portfolios for 2 years, guiding them toward returns that funded this entire lifestyle. They had no idea that their trusted financial advisor, the one Harrison Sr. bragged about at the golf club, was actually forwarding everything to me for analysis and strategy. That night after the Harrison family dinner, I lay awake replaying his father's dismissive laughter while Jake snored beside me. The clock on my nightstand glowed 3:47 a.m. when I finally gave up on sleep and went downstairs to make chamomile tea. The kitchen felt different in the darkness, less like a stage where I performed my wifely duties and more like a space where I could actually think. I sat at the island with my laptop intending to review some code, but instead found myself looking at photos of my mother on Facebook. She'd posted about her book club meeting, sitting with her friends in someone's modest living room in Ohio. And they all looked genuinely happy in a way I couldn't remember feeling anymore. The next morning brought another performance, but this time something shifted. Jake sat at his usual spot at the breakfast counter, scrolling through his phone while I set down his perfectly prepared plate. I'd been thinking about my mother's upcoming surgery, how she'd be alone in that small apartment trying to manage with a walker. "I need to visit Mom next week," I said, pouring his coffee. "Her hip replacement is scheduled for Thursday." Jake didn't look up from his screen. "That woman still lives in a rental, doesn't she? At her age. It's embarrassing." That woman. Not my mother, not the person who'd raised me alone after Dad died, just that woman. I felt my jaw tighten as I set the coffee pot down harder than necessary. "She's having major surgery, Jake. She needs someone there. Then send money for a nurse. We can't have you disappearing to Ohio right now. The Goldman presentation is coming up." He waved his hand dismissively, still staring at his phone. Then something on the screen made him smile, a real smile, not the practiced one he used for clients. His thumb moved quickly, typing a response to whatever had caused that genuine joy I hadn't seen directed at me in months. When he noticed me watching, he quickly deleted whatever he'd been typing and set the phone face down. "Actually, I should head in early today," he said, abandoning his half-eaten breakfast. "David Lawson is coming by to discuss some technical restructuring." David Lawson. The name sent a small warning signal through my mind, but Jake was already heading upstairs to grab his briefcase. I heard the garage door open and close, leaving me alone with his cold eggs and my growing unease about that deleted message and sudden smile. 3 days later, I was in our home office performing the quarterly backup of Meridian Capital's files. Jake insisted we maintain personal copies of everything, paranoid about server crashes or cyber attacks. The external drives hummed as terabytes of data transferred, and I usually used this time to review the code, checking for any bugs or optimization opportunities. But this time a folder caught my attention, restructuring confidential Q3. My finger hovered over the mouse before clicking. Inside were documents dated 3 weeks ago that made my blood run cold. A draft press release announced David Lawson as Meridian Capital's new Chief Technology Officer. Not consultant, not advisor, but CTO. My role, or what my role should have been if I'd ever been acknowledged. The organizational chart showed Jake at the top, David directly below him, and 3 new partners from his Princeton Eating Club filling out the executive team. My name appeared nowhere, not even in the footnotes or appendix. The final document was worse. A memo titled, Operational Efficiency Initiative, outlined plans for streamlining operations by eliminating redundant positions. Redundant. 8 years of building every technical system that made Meridian Capital function, and I was redundant. At the bottom, in Jake's distinctive handwriting, was a note. Implementation after Q2 personal matter resolved. Personal matter. Is that what I'd become? My hands shook as I copied everything to a hidden partition on my personal laptop. The quarterly backup continued its progress bar crawl while I sat there absorbing the reality that my elimination had been planned, documented, and scheduled like any other business transaction. 2 days later, I needed air and decided to grab lunch at the small cafe near Meridian's office building. I rarely ate out alone, but the walls of our house had started feeling like they were closing in. The place was crowded with the usual financial district lunch crowd, and I'd just ordered a sandwich when Julia Brennan, Jake's secretary, walked in with another woman I didn't recognize. They sat directly behind me, close enough that I could smell Julia's aggressive perfume. I pulled out my phone, pretending to read while actually hitting record. So the birthday surprise at Marcello's is all set, Julia said, her voice carrying that gossipy excitement that meant she was sharing insider information. 40 guests, private dining room, the works. Whose birthday? Her friend asked. The wife's, but that's not really what it's about. Jake's finally ready to make the change he's been planning. You know, the situation we've all been waiting for him to handle. They laughed, and I felt my stomach turn as Julia continued. The poor thing still brings him lunch every Tuesday like some devoted housewife from the 50s. She has no idea what's coming. Everyone at the office knows about Alexandra, everyone except her. Alexandra. The name hit me like ice water. I kept my breathing steady, my eyes fixed on my phone screen while recording every word. He's really going through with it? Her friend asked. Oh, definitely. He's been moving assets for months. By the time she figures it out, there won't be anything left to fight over. Princeton boys always protect their money. They kept talking, but I'd heard enough. I paid for my untouched sandwich and left, my phone burning in my pocket with evidence of my own scheduled destruction. I walked for an hour through the city streets, letting the September air clear my head while pieces of the puzzle clicked into place. The deleted texts, the early morning meetings with David Lawson, the restructuring documents, and now this Alexandra person everyone seemed to know about except me. That evening, I texted Rachel Murphy, my friend from MIT who now worked in financial forensics. We hadn't spoken in 2 years, but she responded immediately, suggesting we meet at a bar in Brooklyn the next night. The place she chose was perfect. A dive bar near the Navy Yard where bankers and their wives would never venture. Rachel looked exactly the same, her red hair pulled back in the messy bun she'd worn all through graduate school. She hugged me tight, then pulled back to study my face. You look like someone who's discovered their house is built on quicksand, she said, ordering us both whiskeys. I told her everything. The documents, the conversation I'd overheard, Jake's behavioral changes, the systematic erasure of my contributions to Meridian. Rachel listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding as she recognized patterns. Lexi, this isn't just a divorce setup, she said finally, sliding her business card across the scarred wooden table. This is asset stripping and strategic positioning. He's not just planning to leave you. He's planning to leave you with nothing while making it look like you never contributed anything to begin with. She pulled out her tablet, showing me similar cases she'd investigated. Men like Jake don't just walk away. They scorched earth. They destroy what they leave behind to ensure their narrative is the only one that survives. Rachel's words echoed in my mind during the entire drive home from Brooklyn. Men like Jake don't just leave, they destroy what they leave behind. I gripped the steering wheel tighter as I pulled into our garage at 11 p.m., finding Jake passed out on the leather couch in his study, 3 empty scotch glasses on the side table. The Princeton reunion planning committee papers were scattered across his chest, rising and falling with his snoring. This had become his Thursday night ritual, drinking with his college buddies over video calls, reliving their glory days while plotting their continued dominance in the financial world. I stood in the doorway studying him for a moment. Even unconscious, he maintained that air of entitlement, his mouth slightly open, one hand still loosely holding his phone. The screen lit up with a notification from Alexandra. Just her name, no last name in his contacts, like she was already intimate enough to need no further identification. I left him there and grabbed my laptop, heading to the guest bathroom at the far end of the house. It sounds absurd working from a bathroom, but it was the only room where I could lock the door without raising questions if Jake woke up. I lowered the toilet lid, balanced my laptop on it, and sat on the edge of the bathtub with a notepad. If I was going to protect myself from Jake's planned destruction, I needed to build something stronger than his Princeton network. I needed to become invisible in the same way he'd been making me invisible, but with purpose. The first step was creating Nemesis Holdings. I'd learned about offshore structuring while helping the Harrisons minimize their tax obligations, setting up their shells in Delaware and their holdings in the Caymans. Now I used that same knowledge for my own protection. Each entity I created looked legitimate on paper, with proper documentation and registration numbers that would pass casual scrutiny. Bermuda for the main holding company, Cayman subsidiaries for the investment arms, and a Delaware LLC to interface with U.S. operations. By 3 a.m., I had 7 interconnected companies that existed only in legal documents and encrypted servers, all controlled by me through passwords Jake would never think to look for. The opportunity to weaponize this structure came sooner than expected. That Sunday we were at the Harrison estate for dinner when Jake's father started complaining about the mortgage rates on their Southampton property. Highway robbery, Harrison Sr. grumbled over his second martini. 7% on a jumbo loan even with our credit score. These banks have no respect anymore. I looked up from my barely touched salmon, an idea forming with crystalline clarity. You know, some of my MIT alumni have started an investment fund. They're looking for stable, low-risk opportunities. Real estate-backed loans to established families, that sort of thing. Margaret Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, the first time she'd shown interest in anything I'd said in months. Really? What kind of terms? Much better than bank rates. Maybe 4.5% flexible payment schedules. They prefer to work with people they can trust. I kept my voice casual, cutting another piece of salmon. I could make an introduction if you'd like. Within a week I was orchestrating the deal of a lifetime. The investment partners I'd invented had impressive backgrounds I fabricated from LinkedIn profiles and Harvard Business School directories. I created email addresses, phone numbers that forwarded to burner phones, and even had a friend from MIT pose as one of the partners for a brief phone call with Harrison's lawyer. The documentation was flawless, pages and pages of standard lending language that any attorney would recognize. But buried in subsection 47C was a single paragraph about acceleration clauses tied to material changes in family relationships of the primary borrower. Harrison's lawyer, a golf buddy more interested in his fee than due diligence, skimmed through it during a rushed Friday afternoon review. Standard stuff, he told Harrison Sr., actually better terms than I usually see. The $15 million refinancing went through the following week. The Harrisons celebrated their financial cleverness at dinner, toasting their shrewd negotiation skills while I smiled quietly, knowing they'd just handed me a loaded weapon that could destroy them with 7 minutes' notice. But property was just the beginning. The real prize was Meridian Capital itself. During our scheduled maintenance windows, when the trading systems were offline for updates and patches, I began the delicate process of fragmenting the Pythia algorithm. It was like performing surgery on my own creation, carefully separating components that had been designed to work as an integrated whole. The beauty was in how I structured it. Each piece appeared to be a routine update or patch, things Jake had to approve as part of normal operations. He'd sign the authorization forms I placed on his desk without reading them, usually while talking on the phone or reviewing portfolios. Just technical stuff, he'd mutter, scrawling his signature while already thinking about his next meeting. What he was actually signing were licensing agreements between Meridian Capital and various Nemesis Holdings subsidiaries. The neural network components were licensed from one entity, the predictive modeling from another, the data processing protocols from a third. Individually, these agreements looked like standard vendor relationships. Together, they meant Meridian Capital no longer owned the very technology that made it valuable. They were renting their own brain from me, and the rental agreement had some very specific terms about what happened if payments stopped or contracts were breached. The final piece involved Jake's sisters. Emma and Sophia had always treated me like the help, but they were happy enough to accept my assistance when it came to their trust funds. During one of our family dinners, when they were complaining about tax implications on their distributions, I offered to help restructure their trusts for better efficiency. "You know about this stuff?" Emma asked, her surprise borderline insulting. "I've picked up a few things," I said modestly, not mentioning my doctorate included extensive financial modeling coursework. The restructuring I proposed looked brilliant on paper. Better tax treatment, higher yields, more flexible access to funds. What they didn't notice was that their father had to sign as guarantor for certain obligations that were intrinsically linked to his property loans through a complex web of cross-default provisions. If one domino fell, they all would. "You're so sweet to help us," Sophia said, air-kissing my cheek after signing the papers. "Especially considering your background." My background. As if growing up middle class in Ohio was a disease I should apologize for. I smiled and accepted their condescension, knowing that their signatures had just completed the financial architecture that would bring their entire world crashing down when I decided to pull the trigger. By the time I finished building my avalanche, it was invisible but omnipresent, woven through every aspect of their financial lives like a virus waiting to activate. 3 weeks had passed since I'd completed the financial architecture of my revenge, and the weight of carrying this secret alone was starting to crack my carefully maintained facade. That's when my mother called to say she was coming to visit. She'd booked her flight without asking, simply announcing she'd be staying for the weekend. Jake rolled his eyes when I told him, muttering something about having to endure Ohio wisdom, while he had important networking to do. Mom arrived on a Friday afternoon while Jake was at the office. When I opened the door, she took one long look at me and pulled me into a hug that lasted longer than our usual greeting. She felt thinner than I remembered, but her arms were still strong, still capable of holding me together when I felt like falling apart. She didn't comment on the house or the expensive furniture or any of the status symbols Jake insisted we display. She just studied my face with those sharp brown eyes that had always seen straight through me. "You've lost weight," she said, setting down her worn duffel bag in our marble foyer. "I've been busy," I replied, leading her to the kitchen. We made small talk while I prepared tea, discussing her book club and her neighbor's new grandson. But when Jake's BMW pulled into the driveway earlier than expected, I felt my whole body tense. Mom noticed immediately how I straightened my spine, how my hands moved to smooth my hair, how I quickly checked my appearance in the microwave's reflection. Jake breezed in, gave my mother a perfunctory kiss on the cheek that barely made contact, and announced he had a golf weekend with clients. He'd be leaving early Saturday morning and returning Sunday night. The relief I felt at his departure must have shown on my face because Mom reached across the counter and squeezed my hand as soon as his car disappeared down the street. Saturday morning, after Jake left at dawn for his golf outing, Mom made scrambled eggs and toast while I sat at the kitchen table in my pajamas for the first time in years. The morning sun streamed through the windows, and for a moment I felt like I was back in our old kitchen in Ohio before Jake, before Meridian, before I learned to make myself small. "How long has he been this cruel?" Mom asked suddenly, not looking up from the eggs she was plating. The question hit me unexpectedly, and I felt tears spring to my eyes before I could stop them. "I don't know what you mean." She turned to face me, her expression soft but determined. "Sweetheart, I watched you flinch when his car pulled up yesterday. You checked your appearance 3 times before he walked through the door. You apologized for the brand of tea in your own home. So I'm asking you again, how long?" The dam broke. I told her everything through choking sobs. The systematic erasure from Meridian, the Princeton Boys Club that had replaced me, the overheard conversations about Alexandra, the divorce planning I'd discovered. Mom listened without interrupting, occasionally reaching over to squeeze my hand or push tissues across the table. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Your father had a first wife, she said finally. Before me. Fisha. She waited too long to leave, kept thinking things would get better, that he'd change. By the time she finally got out, she'd lost everything. Not just money but herself. She stood up and pulled me to my feet. Come on. We're packing you a go bag. Just in case. We spent the afternoon filling a small suitcase with essentials, clothes, copies of important documents I'd been gathering, cash I'd been slowly withdrawing in small amounts. Mom helped me hide it behind old skiing equipment in the basement storage room, a place Jake never ventured. When you're ready to leave, she said, you call me. Day or night. I'll be here. The Tuesday after Mom left, I was working from home when the doorbell rang. A delivery driver stood there with an elaborate bouquet of peonies, soft pink and white ones that must have cost a fortune. I'd mentioned once years ago that peonies were my least favorite flower. They seemed gaudy and overblown to me, but apparently someone else loved them. The card was small, cream-colored with gold edges. Can't wait for your freedom. My hands trembled as I carried the bouquet inside. This wasn't meant for me. The delivery driver had made a mistake, or maybe this was exactly the mistake I needed to see. I found the florist's card and called, affecting a cheerful voice. Hi, I just received a beautiful bouquet, but I want to make sure the standing order is correct for next week. Oh yes, Mrs. Harrison, the florist chirped. Mr. Harrison's weekly arrangement for Ms. Alexandra Thornton. Should we continue delivering to the Ritz-Carlton downtown, Suite 1247? That's perfect, I managed to say. Same time. Every Tuesday at 2 p.m. as usual. He's been so consistent for the past 6 months. Miss Thornton is lucky to have such a devoted friend. 6 months. While I'd been trying to save our marriage, he'd been sending another woman peonies every week at the hotel where he supposedly had client meetings. Suite 1247. I wrote it down with a steady hand, though inside I was screaming. 2 weeks later, Jake insisted I accompany him to the Princeton alumni dinner. We need to present a united front, he said, not noticing the irony. He positioned me at the wives' table in the corner while he held court with potential investors near the bar. I sat between a plastic surgeon's third wife and a hedge fund manager's girlfriend who couldn't have been older than 22, both of them discussing vacation homes while I pushed salmon around my plate. Then I heard Jake's voice carrying across the room. Someone had asked about Meridian's algorithm, and Jake was explaining my work down to the specific mathematical models I'd developed during my doctorate. He even used my exact phrases from our early morning discussions years ago, when we'd still been partners in more than just name. I forced myself to smile and nod when the plastic surgeon's wife asked if I was proud of my husband's success. Across the room I caught the eye of Thomas Morrison, my old MIT professor who'd served as an advisor on my dissertation. He was standing near the bar, and the look he gave me was one of complete understanding. He knew exactly whose work Jake was describing. He raised his water glass slightly in my direction, a silent acknowledgement of the truth we both knew but couldn't speak in this room full of Jake's allies. The next day I drove to the storage unit I'd rented under one of my Nemesis Holdings LLCs. Inside I'd created a command center of sorts. Bankers' boxes lined the walls, each one carefully labeled and containing different aspects of my evidence. Financial documents showing the systematic removal of my name from patents and contracts. Printed emails between Jake and his lawyer discussing the cleanest exit strategy. The recorded conversation from the coffee shop where Julia had laughed about my ignorance. I spent hours setting up the automated triggers that would execute everything simultaneously once activated. Each envelope was prepared, sealed, and labeled. One for the SEC containing evidence of Jake's misrepresentation to investors. One for Harrison Senior's mortgage company with the acceleration notice. One for Yale's financial aid office freezing the trust funds. And one special one for Jake, containing just 7 lines that would spell out exactly how his empire depended on systems he'd never bothered to understand. I locked the storage unit and drove home with the sealed envelope tucked safely in my laptop bag. Tonight was my 32nd birthday, though Jake hadn't mentioned it once this morning. Instead, he'd reminded me twice about dinner at Marcello's, insisting I be ready by 7 sharp. The pretense of celebration while planning my public execution would have been laughable if it weren't so cruel. When I arrived home at 4:30, Jake was already there, standing in our bedroom with 3 dresses laid out on the bed. His presence in our closet handling my clothes, felt like a violation. He held up a red cocktail dress I'd worn to last year's company Christmas party, studying it with the critical eye of someone selecting props for a performance. "Wear something sophisticated tonight," he said without looking at me. "Not that black thing you always default to. We'll have important people there." I picked up the simple black sheath dress from my side of the closet, the one he'd just dismissed. It was elegant in its simplicity, bought with my own money before we were married, from a time when I dressed for myself rather than his expectations. "I think I'll wear this one." He turned to face me, his jaw tightening the way it did when I defied him in small ways. "Lexi," I just said. "It's my birthday dinner, isn't it?" I interrupted, meeting his gaze steadily. "I should wear what makes me comfortable." Something flickered across his face, surprise maybe or calculation. He hadn't expected pushback, not tonight when he thought I was walking blindly into his trap. He shrugged and turned back to his side of the closet, pulling out his navy Armani suit. I sat at my vanity applying makeup while he dressed, watching him in the mirror as he fastened his cufflinks. They were new, platinum with small sapphires that caught the light. I'd never seen them before, but I recognized the jewelry box on his dresser from Cartier. The same store where Alexandra Thornton had posted Instagram photos last month, though Jake didn't know I'd looked her up after discovering the peonies. "Those are beautiful cufflinks," I said, applying mascara with a steady hand. "New. A gift from a client," he replied too quickly, not meeting my eyes in the mirror. "For closing the Patterson deal." The Patterson deal had closed 3 months ago, but I didn't point that out. Instead, I reached into my laptop bag and transferred the black envelope to my evening purse, feeling its weight like a loaded weapon. The automated triggers were set to activate at 8:47 p.m. exactly, synchronized to execute the moment I handed him the envelope. 7 minutes from that moment, his entire world would begin collapsing. The drive to Marcello's took 20 minutes through evening traffic. Jake spent it on his phone, texting rapidly while I watched the city lights blur past. At one point he chuckled at something on his screen, and I caught a glimpse of Julia's name before he angled the phone away. They were probably coordinating the final details of my humiliation. Marcello's occupied the top floor of a boutique hotel downtown, its private dining room a study in calculated luxury. When the elevator doors opened, I could already hear voices and laughter from behind the frosted glass doors. Jake placed his hand on my lower back, guiding me forward like a lamb to slaughter. The room was packed with 40 guests, and my stomach twisted as I recognized the faces. Every single person was from Jake's world. His Princeton buddies, his Meridian Capital partners, their wives and girlfriends who lunched at the same exclusive clubs and vacationed in the Hamptons. Not one of my friends was there. Not even acquaintances from my MIT alumni network. This wasn't a birthday celebration. It was a carefully curated audience for Jake's performance. The seating arrangement told me everything I needed to know. Jake's place card sat at the head of the table, commanding the room. Mine was at the far end, isolated like an afterthought. But the real revelation was the place card to Jake's right, Alexandra Thornton, printed in the same elegant calligraphy as all the others. She was already there, wearing a white dress that highlighted her blonde hair, laughing at something David Lawson was saying. She looked up when we entered, and her eyes met mine for a fraction of a second before sliding away. "Happy birthday, Lexi," Margaret Harrison said, air-kissing my cheek with lips that barely moved. Her smile was the kind you'd give someone at a funeral, full of pity and uncomfortable acknowledgement. I took my seat at the far end of the table, surrounded by the younger wives who immediately began discussing their Pilates instructor. The champagne was already flowing, glasses constantly refilled by attentive wait staff. I noticed how people kept glancing at me, then looking away when I caught their eyes. Julia actually smirked when our gazes met, lifting her glass in a mock toast. The dinner progressed with painful predictability. 7 courses of elaborate food I couldn't taste, accompanied by wines Jake selected to impress his audience. He held court at his end of the table, telling stories about deals and conquests while Alexandra touched his arm and laughed at all the right moments. By the time the dessert course arrived, an elaborate chocolate soufflé with a single candle, the room was buzzing with anticipation. Jake stood, tapping his crystal glass with a silver spoon. The chatter died immediately, all eyes turning to him as he commanded the room's attention. He looked confident, powerful, every inch the successful man he'd always wanted to be. His smile was the coldest thing I'd ever seen. "Before we toast to Lexi's birthday," he began, his voice carrying that particular tone of someone about to deliver a punchline, "I have an announcement to make." The room held its breath. I could feel 40 pairs of eyes shifting between Jake and me, waiting for the blow to land. "Congratulations, failure," he said, looking directly at me. "We're finished." The laughter erupted like champagne from a shaken bottle, explosive and effervescent. His Princeton brothers raised their glasses, cheering like they'd just witnessed a winning touchdown. The wives tittered behind manicured hands while Alexandra actually applauded, her white dress making her look like a bride at her own rehearsal dinner. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I didn't give them the devastation they'd paid admission to see. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the black envelope, standing slowly and walking the length of the table with measured steps. The laughter began to fade as they watched me approach Jake with something they hadn't expected: complete composure. I slid the envelope across the marble table toward him, my voice perfectly steady when I spoke. "Before you celebrate, you should probably explain to your sisters why their tuition disappears, to your parents why their house and cars vanish in minutes, and to your partners why the company dies before dessert is served." The silence was absolute. Jake's triumphant smile wavered as he looked down at the envelope, then back at me. His hand hesitated before picking it up, and I saw the first crack in his confidence. "Enjoy the soufflé," I said, turning and walking toward the door. "You have about 7 minutes." Behind me, I heard the tear of paper as Jake opened the envelope. I was already at the elevator when the first phone started buzzing, then another, then dozens as the automated triggers I'd programmed began their synchronized destruction. The elevator doors closed on the sound of Harrison Sr.'s voice shouting something about his lawyer. I walked through Marcello's lobby and out into the cool night air, my heels clicking on the pavement as I made my way to my Tesla parked across the street. Inside, I opened my laptop and watched the dashboards I'd configured light up with confirmation messages. The loan acceleration notices. The system lockdowns. The trust fund freezes. Every domino falling exactly as planned. Through Marcello's floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the chaos erupting in the private dining room. Jake was frantically tearing open the envelope while his father pushed through the crowd toward the balcony, phone already pressed to his ear. Through my Tesla's windshield, I watched Harrison Sr. pace back and forth, his free arm waving wildly as he shouted at whoever was unfortunate enough to answer his call at this hour. Margaret Harrison had knocked over an entire tray of champagne glasses in her rush to reach her phone, the crystal shattering across Marcello's marble floor like scattered diamonds. The sound must have been tremendous, though I couldn't hear it from my position across the street. I started the car and drove to my Brooklyn brownstone, the one I had purchased through Nemesis Holdings 14 months earlier. Jake never knew about this place. He thought I spent my occasional nights away at my mother's apartment or budget hotels when I claimed to need space. The 3-story building sat on a quiet tree-lined street in Park Slope, far enough from Manhattan's financial district that no one from Jake's circle would ever accidentally stumble upon it. This was my sanctuary, furnished simply but comfortably with pieces I had chosen myself, paid for with consulting fees Jake never knew I had earned by reviewing code for startups under a pseudonym. Once inside, I set my laptop on the kitchen table and opened the monitoring dashboards I had configured. The number of missed calls on my phone had already reached 47, but I turned it to silent and placed it face down. The real story was unfolding on my screen in real-time data streams and system logs that painted a picture of complete operational collapse. Meridian Capital's primary trading platform had gone dark at exactly 8:54 p.m., 7 minutes after I had handed Jake the envelope. The backup systems attempted to engage but found themselves locked behind biometric authentication they could not bypass. Client portals displayed error messages in languages that cycled randomly, Mandarin to Swedish to Arabic. A small touch I had added simply because I could. David Lawson was sending increasingly frantic emails to the development team, each one more desperate than the last, demanding someone explain why he had no administrative access to systems he supposedly controlled. Rachel sent me encrypted updates every few hours. The Harrison estate in Southampton had received notice of immediate loan acceleration. The mortgage company was initiating foreclosure proceedings that would have the property in receivership within 10 days unless $14 million appeared immediately. Yale's financial aid office had frozen Emma and Sophia's accounts after their trust fund payments reversed. Both sisters were currently locked out of their student portals, unable to access grades, transcripts, or even their university email accounts. I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my living room, surrounded by the blessed silence of a space that belonged entirely to me. No performing, no pretending, no walking on eggshells wondering what mood Jake would bring home. The irony was not lost on me that in destroying their world, I had finally found peace in mine. For 3 days I maintained this silence, watching their empire crumble through data points and system failures while ignoring the increasingly desperate voicemails that filled my phone. On the morning of the 4th day, my doorbell rang at 6:43 a.m. Through the security camera I had installed, I saw Jake standing on my brownstone steps. He looked like a completely different person from the man who had stood triumphantly at Marcello's just 72 hours earlier. His Armani suit was wrinkled and stained, the same one from the party. His Princeton class ring was conspicuously absent from his finger, likely pawned for quick cash. The designer stubble he carefully maintained had grown into an actual unkempt beard, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who had not slept in days. I opened the door but did not invite him in, letting him stand on the step while I remained in my doorway, coffee mug in hand. The morning was crisp and I noticed him shivering slightly in his wrinkled suit jacket. "Please," he said, and the word seemed to physically hurt him. It came out cracked and foreign, like his mouth had never formed those syllables before. This man who had commanded boardrooms and dominated conversations could not even meet my eyes as he stood on my doorstep like a beggar. "Please, what, Jake?" I asked, taking a sip of my coffee. "The company is gone. Everything is frozen. My parents are losing their house. Emma and Sophia cannot graduate. The SEC is investigating me personally for misrepresentation of technological assets to investors." His voice broke on the last word. "Just tell me what you want. Tell me how to fix this." "You cannot fix this," I replied simply. "You can only live with the consequences of your choices, just as you expected me to live with mine." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "My lawyer said to give you this." The letterhead from Fuller and Associates was impressive, as was the thickness of the packet. 23 pages of legal threats claiming extortion, theft of trade secrets, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and various other creative interpretations of criminal law. I smiled as I flipped through it, recognizing the desperate language of attorneys who knew they had no case but needed to justify their retainer. "You should go," I told Jake, starting to close the door. "This is not over," he said, finding a spark of his old arrogance. "My lawyers will destroy you." That afternoon, I forwarded the Fuller and Associates packet to Catherine Blackwood, my attorney at Blackstone Legal. Catherine was brilliant, ruthless, and had been preparing for this exact scenario for months. Within 2 hours she had crafted a response that included documentation proving I owned every line of code Meridian Capital relied upon. She attached the audio recording from the coffee shop where Julia discussed Jake's plan to cut Lexi out completely once the investors are secured. She included emails between Jake and David Lawson planning my termination. Every threat Fuller and Associates had made became evidence of Jake's attempted theft of my intellectual property. 2 days later my doorbell rang again. This time the security camera showed Alexandra Thornton standing on my steps. She wore jeans and a simple sweater, her blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. Gone was the white dress and perfect makeup from Marcello's. She looked younger, more vulnerable, and surprisingly nervous. I opened the door but again did not invite her in. "I am not here as Jake's anything," she said quickly. "I am here because I have been gathering evidence of his fraudulent dealings with my clients' portfolios. He has been using my position at Goldman to access insider information." She held out a flash drive. "Everything is on here. Trade records, emails, recorded conversations where he explicitly discusses using material non-public information." I studied her for a moment. "Why would you give this to me?" "Because he destroyed my career the same way he tried to destroy yours. The only difference is you saw it coming and fought back." She paused. "I thought perhaps we could work together." I took the flash drive but shook my head. "I appreciate this, but I do not need an alliance. I have everything required to ensure Jake faces appropriate consequences." I reached into my pocket and handed her a business card. "This is the SEC investigator who has been calling me. He would be very interested in what you have documented. Alexandra took the card, nodded once and walked away. I closed the door and returned to my laptop, where another dozen system alerts confirmed that Jake's world continued its methodical collapse. The unraveling was complete, and I had not even needed to leave my brownstone to watch it happen. I closed the door behind Alexandra and returned to my laptop, where Catherine Blackwood had just sent an email marked urgent. The Meridian Capital Board had called an emergency meeting for tomorrow morning at 9. They wanted to discuss the technological crisis, and had discovered, through their frantic investigation, that all roads led back to Nemesis Holdings. Catherine had already informed them that I would be attending, not as Jake's estranged wife, but as the controlling owner of their entire technical infrastructure. The next morning, I dressed in a navy suit I had purchased specifically for this moment. Not designer, not flashy, just professionally elegant in a way that said I meant business. The Meridian Capital offices occupied the 32nd floor of a Manhattan high-rise, the same building where I had once served coffee to investors who looked through me. This time when I walked through those glass doors, the receptionist's eyes widened in recognition and confusion. The boardroom fell silent when I entered. 7 board members sat around the polished mahogany table, including Jake, who looked like he had aged 5 years in the past week. David Lawson was there, his Wharton MBA useless in the face of actual technical complexity. Harrison Sr. occupied his usual seat despite no longer being able to afford the parking garage fee for the building. I did not take the chair they had set for me at the far end of the table. Instead, I walked to the presentation screen and connected my laptop with practiced efficiency. The first slide appeared, showing the complete ownership structure of the Pythia algorithm. "Gentlemen," I began, noting how they flinched at my formal address, "you called this meeting to discuss your technological crisis. Let me clarify your position. Every line of code that Meridian Capital depends upon belongs to Nemesis Holdings, which is wholly owned by me. The licensing agreements you have been operating under expired the moment Jake publicly announced our divorce at Marcello's, triggering the morality clause in subsection 12. I clicked to the next slide, showing the patent filings, all dated and registered under my name before Meridian Capital existed. I created the Pythia algorithm during my doctoral work at MIT. The patents were filed under my maiden name, Lexington Brooks, which is why your due diligence never found them." Board member Marcus Webb, a silver-haired venture capitalist who had always been the most pragmatic of the group, leaned forward. "What do you want?" I smiled and advanced to the next slide. "You have 2 options. Option 1. Recognize me as the founder and majority owner of Meridian Capital, with 70% equity based on the valuation of the intellectual property I created. Jake retains 5%, the board splits the remaining 25%. Option 2. I sell everything to Quantum Partners for pennies on the dollar, and you explain to your investors why their portfolios are now worthless." "This is extortion," Jake spat, finding his voice for the first time. "No," I replied calmly. "This is capitalism. I own something you need. I am offering to sell it to you at a fair price. The fact that you never bothered to secure ownership of your company's fundamental technology is not my problem to solve." The board exchanged glances. They were trapped and everyone in the room knew it. Without Pythia, Meridian Capital was just another investment firm with nice offices and no competitive advantage. "We need time to discuss," Webb said carefully. "You have 1 hour," I replied, closing my laptop. "My attorney is waiting in the lobby with the contracts. Decide quickly because Quantum Partners is eager to acquire these assets." I spent that hour in a coffee shop across the street, watching through the window as messenger after messenger arrived at the building, likely lawyers and advisors being summoned for emergency consultation. When I returned, the contracts were signed. I was now the majority owner of the company I had built from nothing. 3 days later, the Wall Street Journal published their investigation. The headlines stretched across the front page of the business section: "The Ghost Genius Who Built and Rebuilt Meridian Capital." The reporter, Susan Chin, had done her homework. She had interviewed Professor Morrison from MIT, who confirmed I had been the sole creator of the Pythia algorithm. She had spoken with former employees who remembered me coding through the night while Jake attended networking events. The timeline was devastating, showing how each of Meridian's major successes corresponded with improvements I had made to the algorithm, while my systematic erasure from company records coincided with Jake bringing in his Princeton network. The article included a photo from my MIT graduation, standing with my doctoral advisor beside a presentation board showing the early framework of Pythia. Next to it was a recent photo of Jake at an industry conference, presenting my work as his own innovation. The contrast was damning. My phone buzzed with interview requests from CNBC, Bloomberg, and Forbes, but I declined them all. The truth was public now, and I had more important work to do. I scheduled a meeting with Quantum Partners, not as a desperate seller but as someone with assets to leverage. We met in their conference room overlooking Central Park, the same room where Jake had once pitched them on a partnership they had declined. $40 million for the complete Pythia algorithm, I stated simply. Non-exclusive license with a 5-year non-compete clause for the financial sector. They agreed within 10 minutes. The wire transfer was confirmed by lunch. That afternoon I signed the lease for Athena Financial's offices, 6 floors below where Meridian Capital was beginning its death spiral. I had already recruited my team. Dr. Sarah Okoro, whom the Federal Reserve had passed over for promotion 3 times despite her groundbreaking work in monetary policy modeling. Jessica Martinez, whose revolutionary risk assessment algorithms had been credited to her male supervisor at Goldman. Amy Patterson, a coder whose innovations in high-frequency trading had made millions for firms that refused to promote her beyond junior developer. As we stood in our new offices looking out at the city skyline, Sarah raised her coffee mug in a toast. To the overlooked and underestimated. While we were celebrating our beginning, Jake was facing his end. The SEC investigation had uncovered years of misrepresentation to investors. With Alexandra's evidence, they had proof of insider trading. His Princeton partners distanced themselves publicly, claiming they had been deceived about the technology's origins. David Lawson resigned and returned to consulting. The investors pulled their funds en masse, and within 2 weeks, Meridian Capital existed only on paper. Harrison Sr. filed for bankruptcy on a Tuesday. The Southampton estate was sold at auction to cover debts. Margaret moved in with her sister in Parsippany, her social standing destroyed. Emma and Sophia transferred to state schools, taking jobs at department stores to pay rent on the small apartment they now shared. The Harrison dynasty, built on borrowed brilliance and stolen innovation, had crumbled completely. My mother arrived the following week, taking the train from Ohio because she said she wanted to see everything properly. When she walked into Athena Financial's offices and saw my name on the door as CEO and founder, she stopped and touched the lettering with trembling fingers. "You didn't just survive, baby, you soared," my mother said, her fingers still touching the lettering on my office door. She turned to me with tears streaming down her face, and I realized I was crying too. Not from sadness or anger, but from something I hadn't felt in years, pure, uncomplicated pride in what I had built with my own hands and mind. We stood in Athena Financial's reception area as my team prepared for our first major client presentation. The energy in the office was electric, nothing like the suffocating atmosphere at Meridian where everyone performed for Jake's approval. Here, Sarah was explaining her monetary policy model to Jessica, who was incorporating it into her risk assessment framework. Amy had 3 monitors displaying code that would revolutionize how we process market data. We were collaborating, building on each other's ideas, creating something greater than the sum of our parts. The client presentation went flawlessly. Hartman Industries signed a 3-year contract worth $2 million annually, specifically citing their confidence in working with the actual creator of the Pythia algorithm rather than someone who had merely taken credit for it. By the end of our first month, Athena Financial's returns exceeded Meridian's best quarter by 30%. We weren't just succeeding, we were setting new industry standards. Word spread quickly through the financial sector. 3 more brilliant women reached out, each with stories painfully similar to mine. Dr. Lisa Chong, whose quantitative models had generated millions for her previous firm while she remained stuck in middle management. Rebecca Torres, a Harvard MBA whose strategic innovations were consistently presented by her male colleagues as their own ideas. Maria Petrov, whose coding brilliance had built entire trading platforms while being paid half what junior male developers earned. I hired them all. Our office expanded to include the entire floor, and the atmosphere was unlike anything I had experienced in corporate America. We shared ideas openly, credited each other's contributions meticulously, and celebrated successes as a team. There was no hierarchy of whose voice mattered more, No performance of authority, just brilliant minds working together toward a common goal. 6 months after Athena's launch, I attended the Financial Innovation Conference in Chicago, not as someone's +1 or administrative support, but as a keynote speaker. The organizers had specifically requested I present on algorithmic trading in the new economy. I stood backstage adjusting the microphone, wearing a simple black dress I had chosen myself, when I saw him across the convention floor. Jake was manning a booth for Brennan and Associates, a third-tier firm that mostly handled small municipal bonds. His Tom Ford suits had been replaced by off-the-rack polyester that pulled slightly at the shoulders. The Princeton class ring was still absent, and his hair had started thinning in a way that expensive treatments could no longer hide. He was explaining something to a potential client who looked thoroughly unimpressed, desperately trying to project the authority he once wore so naturally. Our eyes met across the crowded convention floor. For a moment, time seemed to pause. I saw recognition flash across his face, followed immediately by something I never thought I would see from Jake Harrison: shame. He looked away first, turning his back to me as if suddenly fascinated by the display materials behind him. The man who had called me a failure in front of 40 people could not face the woman who had rebuilt herself from the ashes of his betrayal. I delivered my keynote to a standing ovation. The audience of 500 industry professionals listened as I explained the next evolution of algorithmic trading, innovations that went far beyond what Pythia had accomplished. During the Q&A session, someone asked about my journey from MIT to founding Athena Financial. I told the truth simply and without bitterness, about how being erased from my own creation had taught me the importance of ownership, documentation, and never allowing anyone to diminish your contributions. After the conference, I used $10 million from the Quantum Partners sale to establish the Nemesis Foundation. The name was deliberate, a reminder that sometimes justice comes from unexpected places. The foundation would provide funding, mentorship, and legal support for women whose technological contributions had been stolen, erased, or appropriated. Professor Thomas Morrison from MIT agreed to serve on the board, helping identify candidates whose brilliance was being systematically overlooked. Our first grant went to a programmer in Seattle whose machine learning innovations had been patented under her supervisor's name. The second went to a team of 3 women whose startup had been destroyed by a hostile takeover that claimed their technology as pre-existing intellectual property. Within 6 months, we were supporting 27 women across the country, each one building something extraordinary from the ruins of what had been taken from them. One evening, as I stood in my office overlooking the Hudson River, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I knew immediately it was Jake. He had probably gotten a new phone after his previous one was disconnected for non-payment. The message was short: "You destroyed everything." I took a photo of Athena Financial's latest success, our feature in Forbes as one of the top 10 most innovative financial firms in America, and sent it as my reply. Then I deleted his number and blocked it, feeling the last thread connecting us finally sever. He was right in a way. I had destroyed everything built on lies, theft, and the systematic erasure of my contributions. But from that destruction I had built something infinitely better. I called my mother, who answered on the first ring as always. "Mom, I've been looking at apartments near me. There's a beautiful 2-bedroom in my building with a view of the river. It has a reading nook perfect for your book club meetings over video." Her sharp intake of breath told me everything. "Lexi, I couldn't afford." "Mom, I can afford it. We can afford it. You supported me through everything. Let me give something back." As she cried happy tears on the other end of the phone, I looked at my reflection in the darkened window. The woman staring back wasn't the invisible wife who had served coffee while others claimed her work. She wasn't the victim who had been publicly humiliated at her own birthday dinner. She was someone who had taken the worst moment of her life and transformed it into the foundation for something extraordinary. The best revenge, I realized, wasn't just reclaiming what was stolen or watching those who wronged you fall. It was building something so magnificent that their betrayal became merely a footnote in your success story. Jake had thought he was ending my story that night at Marcello's. Instead, he had freed me to write a better one, surrounded by brilliant women who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is refuse to remain invisible. My phone buzzed with emails from potential clients, partnership offers, and interview requests. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to grow Athena Financial into something even greater. But tonight I simply stood in my office, watching the lights of the city twinkle below, finally at peace with the journey that had brought me here. If this story of calculated revenge kept you glued to every word, hit that like button right now. My favorite part was when Lexi slid that black envelope across the marble table at Marcello's, knowing she'd just triggered 7 minutes of total financial destruction. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more gripping stories like this. Subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss an upload.